Hi, welcome to this video about Boundary by Schlappi Engineering. Boundary is an interesting take on a combination of a VCA and a versatile envelope or function generator. You can use Boundary to slew and even rectify signals, or just use it to send audio through and attenuate that audio with the built-in envelope. There's a unique feature on Boundary called the bound parameter, and by sending CV into the bound CV input, you can kind of control how much of your envelope is getting through. And you can use this to create gated cycling envelopes, which I really enjoy. I want to thank Eric and Jay for sending me this beautiful unit. I really wanted to start off this video by facing the camera, just so I can show off my awesome dinosaur t-shirt. Let's listen to some sound examples. First, a few patches where I used Boundary, and after that we'll take a closer look at all the features, all the knobs and the switches on Boundary, and I'll try to demonstrate or explain what they do. If you just installed Boundary without reading the manual thoroughly, it might be a little bit confusing what all these knobs and switches are for. And to get through all of them without confusing you even more, let's just first start off with the envelope or function generation part. The function generator is everything above this line and everything below the other line. So you can essentially just ignore the middle part of the module. I have connected the output of the function or envelope generator, which is this one here, to the scope. And I'm just going to use the envelope coming from Boundary to modulate a filter. I have this LED cable here, which is sending through a trigger coming from Pamela's new workout, and let's just connect it to the trigger input, which is located here. Please keep in mind that these black knobs are for the VCA section, so I will be ignoring this section completely for this part of the video. I'm just using Boundary as an envelope generator to modulate something else, and in this case, like I said, it's just the frequency of a filter. Currently the cycle is off, so we're just triggering a one-shot envelope. On the top here we have the attack or rise knob, and to the right of that we have the fall, which is just like the decay or release setting on another envelope. Let me slow down this trigger. Currently both of these stages are just linear. The slopes are not curved, but we can actually curve the slopes of Boundary by using these knobs. The first one influences the rise parameter and the second one influences the fall parameter. These knobs are accompanied by switches. These are now in the bottom settings, which stand for exponential curves. And if we now turn this up, you'll see that the slope for the attack stage is starting to be a little bit curved. Let me lengthen it here. A similar thing happens for the fall stage. And adjusting these curves also influences the timing of the stages. And of course, if you turn these up completely, you end up with really exaggerated curves. The reason we're sometimes getting these double triggers is because of the behavior of the trigger input, which doesn't re-trigger the envelope while the envelope is in its rise stage. Let's turn these back to linear curves. Then there's the positive settings for these shape CV knobs, and these give us these kind of logarithmic curves. Let me remove the trigger. And you can see that even on a moderate setting for the fall stage that the decay or releases are already really long. Turn it up even more. And at this stage I'm really starting to wonder if it's going to drop. I mean, I think we can sit here for another few minutes before this envelope has dropped completely. So there we are. And of course you can mix these two kinds of slopes. Now you can modulate these rise and fall stages by sending some CV into the rise or fall CV inputs here on the bottom of the module. At this point, these knobs do not longer adjust the curve or the slope of your envelope, but these are now attenuators for the incoming CV. So by turning these completely up, the effect of the incoming CV is maximum. You can send bipolar CV into these inputs, by the way. But if you want the effect to be a little bit more subtle, you can turn down the effect of the CV you're sending in by turning this knob to the left. And of course, it's just the same thing for the rise parameter. And you won't be able to notice at this point, but I've actually inverted the influence of the CV I'm sending into the rise input because this switch was still in the bottom position. Let me route a unipolar LFO to the rise CV input so you can see its effect. Let me slow this LFO down. And now you can clearly see when the LFO moves up, the rise time becomes longer, and I can even make this effect more obvious by turning this CV attenuator completely to the right. And now if I flick this switch back into the lower position, you'll see that when the LFO goes low, the rise time is increased. I love to send in bipolar modulation to this parameter, and I really like to use sample and hold, or stepped random I should say, for this. Actually, let's modulate the fall time instead. And let's now engage the cycle setting of boundary. Now if I remove the trigger, you can see that we have a nice cycling envelope. That changes in length because I'm sending in modulation to the fall parameter. And what the trigger input does now is just re-trigger the envelope, but it, just as before, will not re-trigger the envelope when it's in its rising stage. And you can get really interesting and musical results with this. Let me send in a fault proactive sequence into my VCO here. Let's add some delay to this. Now, before I go into the other features of the function generator on boundary, let me just switch boundary to cycling mode. And let's see how short I can get these envelopes to be. So if I switch both of the slopes to exponential, I can get them to be very high. And I think that's the highest that it can go. Something that might not be apparent because it's not a feature that we usually find on any module. When we send a fault proactive sequence into the bound input, this as well creates some kind of melodic movement, but in a very peculiar way. To show you this, I will change up my routing here, and instead of just listening to the output of boundary, I'm going to send it back into the modulation input of a filter. And by the way, these LEDs here are not just to look pretty. The first LED lights up when the rise stage of boundary is active. The second one lights up when the fall stage is active. And the third one in the middle follows the slew input, which can be negative, by the way, and then this LED will turn red or purple, depending on how quick the voltage is oscillating. But I'll demonstrate the slew parameter later in the video. So what I did here, let me turn off the cycling. I'm sending in a trigger coming from Pamela's new workout. You can see the LED cable light up, but you can also see it here on the scope. It's the red trace. And then there's the blue trace, which isn't connected to anything yet, but I just want to show you that this is a manual offset between 0 and 5 volts. So let's connect the trigger to the trigger input on boundary. We can see the output of boundary as the green trace. So right now there's just a trigger going through the scope into boundary, and we're just monitoring the output of the envelope generator, which is still just modulating a filter. And let me first turn this manual offset completely open. Now that I've done that, let me route that 10 volt offset through to the bound input on boundary. And as you can see, there's not a lot that has changed. But you'll see as soon as I start turning this manual offset down, well, yeah, let's just look at what happens. Let me increase the speed of my trigger here. And now watch the blue line and what the effect is on the envelope of boundary. And this way you can clearly see that whatever voltage we send into the bound input on boundary kind of sets the limit to where the rise parameter can go before it starts falling down again. Let's slow down the trigger again. Now the interesting thing about this is that there won't be any wonky timing even if you turn up the attack, because what's left of the envelope restricted by the bound parameter will always just trigger at the same time. So you won't get these wonky envelopes that kind of pop up somewhere. And that's something that could happen when you just offset your envelopes before sending them to a VCA. And for a moment, let's remove the trigger and just switch to cycling here. And if I now restrict the motion of the envelope by turning down the manual offset, you can see how this influences the behavior of boundary. An interesting side effect of this is that you can do gated cycling. Let me widen this trigger so it's more a gate. This is still coming from Pamela's new workout, by the way. And let me, instead of using the manual offset, let me just run the output of that gate into the bound input on boundary. And you can see by doing this that you get this gated cycling behavior. And at this point you can still modulate everything else here, like the fall parameter, for example. And this makes for a very dynamic situation. Let me add some reverb and delay to this. I want to add a little bit of extra information about the bound parameter on boundary. So let's again open up this filter, which I will be modulating with the output of the envelope generator on boundary. You can see the output of the function generator section of boundary on the scope right now. And I'll show you the voltage that I'm sending into the bound input on the scope here as the red trace. Now, for the moment, there's nothing going in. Now let me connect this to an output of Pamela's new workout, which is outputting a 5-volt gate. And now I'll switch over to using a unipolar LFO that cycles between 0 and 10 volts. And what you can immediately see when you're sending in more voltage into the bound input of boundary, the the function output is a lot higher in amplitude. Now let me switch over to a bipolar LFO, which cycles between 5 and -5 volts. And you might have not expected that the bound input accepts bipolar CV signals. Let me use a manual offset on mats. Right now there's 0 volt going into the bound input. Just watch the red line here to see what I'm sending in. Now let me turn it down, so towards the negative voltages. And now you can see that the effect of sending in -10 volts is exactly the same as the effect we're getting when we're sending in +10 volts. And you can use this to your advantage, for example by just sending in a bipolar stepped random wave. And currently this is a bipolar output cycling between maximum 5 and minimum -5 volts, which causes the amplitude of the function output to be somewhat restricted. But let's switch over to a unipolar sample and hold or stepped random that lives between 0 and 10 volts. And I find things like this very interesting and very exciting. Let me add some reverb to this. And maybe even some delay coming from the feedback module's 1-bit multitap delay. The end of rise gate output on boundary sends out a 10 volt gate whenever the function generator on boundary is not rising. So at the end of rise the gate starts, and at the next start of the rise it stops. I am making it a lot more confusing by explaining it. I'm sure you all know what an end of rise gate output does. And if I now connect a unipolar stepped random LFO to the bound input of boundary, you'll see that the end of rise gate output is also influenced by this modulation, because of course the timing of the envelope changes. And you could use this gate output to trigger or clock other modules, perhaps to trigger a different function generator, or as I will do now, to modulate the frequency of your VCO. Now let's have a look at the other inputs on the function generator section of boundary. And I'm going to start off by sending something into the slew input. For now I will be using this square bipolar LFO, and I will send it into the slew input on boundary. The output of the function generator is still connected to the scope. Let's show it. It's the blue line. And I'm using this output routed through the scope to modulate the frequency of a filter just like before. Now, when the rise and fall settings are completely counterclockwise, there won't be any slew, and the LFO is essentially just going through. And now you can see that when you're sending in bipolar information into the slew input, this LED here, the middle one, shows this bipolar activity. Now let's increase the rise, and we can see and hear that the output of boundary blue trace is no longer a square LFO. The rise of the LFO is slewed or slowed down, and depending on how you set up the curves, this slew is linear, it can be logarithmic, or it can be exponential. Now, this is something that's true for every slew limiter. If you turn up the slew too much, essentially you're just slewing it so much that it's not changing anymore. Instead of slewing the rise, you can slew the fall as well. This is the end of our square LFO. You can see that we can increase the time that it takes for the LFO to drop, or at least the slewed version of it, by turning up the fall parameter on boundary. And again, depending on how you set up the slopes or curves, you can make this fall be slewed logarithmically or exponentially. And of course you can slew both the attack and release stages, or rise and fall stages as they are called on boundary. And it's interesting to be able to slew bipolar signals, as not every slew limiter accepts bipolar signals. And now with the slew set up in such a way that the output of boundary is not rising above 0, this orange arrow here indicates where the 0 is. This is also shown on the middle LED here, which now only is red. So the red signal or red LED indicates negative voltages, and the blue LED indicates positive voltages for the slew output. Of course, all the other modulation parameters like the rise and fall modulation or the bound modulations can still be used when we're slewing something. And let's just send in a slow sine wave LFO into the bound input. This is a bipolar LFO coming from Generate 3. And we can still cycle the function generator as well, which really creates somewhat unpredictable results. So that's the slew functionality of boundary. Now, instead of sending this bipolar square LFO into the slew input, let's send it into the rectify input. I'm still using the output of boundary to modulate the frequency of my filter. And maybe I should hide the yellow trace. Now you can see that our square wave is being rectified, and with the square wave, when you rectify it, you end up with just almost a steady line. Let's change this up to a sine wave. And for the people who don't know what full wave rectification is when you yeah, when you do something with the negative part of a signal. In this case, it's bipolar sine LFO. And in half-wave rectification, you would just see bumps where the original sine LFO goes above 0, and for the negative part, you would just get a line at 0 volts. But in full-wave rectification, like we're seeing on boundary, the negative portion of our bipolar signal is flipped around, so it's positive, and the result is this interesting wave, which you can still slew, by the way. The reason that this is an interesting feature to have on a function generator is because you can use it as an envelope follower. For example, to create ducking envelopes by sending in a kick drum. And if we just send this kick drum into the slew input, so I attenuated the influence of this envelope on my filter, so now it's ducking the frequency. It's a little bit hard to get an accurate response because the slew limiter wants to follow the bipolar oscillations that we're sending in, and what we want it to do is just follow the volume of these oscillations, so the amplitude. You can solve this problem by using the rectify input. And then boundary completely rectifies the thing we are sending in, which is still the kick drum in this case, and this makes it much easier to dial in the rise and fall parameters accurately, so we get a response that satisfies our needs. And you can do a lot of cool things by using function generators as envelope followers. But it's always a good idea to rectify your signal before it's hitting the function generator. So it's very useful to have this built in. Now we'll have a look at the 4-quadrant multiplier section in boundary, which is the middle section here. And I'm actually re-recording this whole segment because, the last take I did, I just made it all way too complicated. While in fact it's just a VCA with 2 CV inputs. The 4-quadrant multiplier section of boundary, which you could also describe as a ring modulator or bipolar VCA, has 2 knobs and 2 switches that change the behavior. The first knob is normalized to the slew output, so we can use the built-in envelope or use the signal that we sent into the slew or the rectify input to open and close the VCA. When you patch something in the first CV input here, this knob will act as an attenuator for that signal. Then there's a second CV input. This input has no attenuator, so these work together to open and close the VCA. I'm running a simple saw wave from even VCO into the scope. It's the green trace. From there I'm sending it into the input. It's this input where you send your signal into that you want to attenuate. This LED visualizes the bipolar nature of the signal we're sending in. On the bottom here, where the red cable is connected, is the output of the VCA. And to make things a little bit easier to explain, I'm using an external envelope that I can invert manually. And you can see this as the yellow trace on the scope. And I'll just connect this envelope to the first CV input here. And now you can see on the scope, and you can hear it as well, that the amplitude of the saw wave that I'm sending in is modulated by the envelope that I'm sending into the CV input on boundary. The thing that sets apart a 4-quadrant multiplier from a regular 2-quadrant multiplier or a regular unipolar VCA, you could call them, is that a 4-quadrant multiplier does not expect positive CV signals. So when I invert this envelope and make it negative, you can see that this signal still opens and closes our VCA. And I hope that you can also see that the saw wave is getting inverted. So whenever you use a negative CV signal to modulate a 4-quadrant multiplier, the signal coming out of it will be inverted. And you can use this to do ring modulation. Let me quickly connect a sine wave to the CV input instead of an unipolar envelope. Maybe at some point we should be able to see. This way you can kind of see that whenever the sine wave we're sending in is above 0, it just amplitude modulates the saw wave. And when it goes below 0, it still amplitude modulates the saw wave, but it also inverts it. And this is what creates the very distinctive sound of ring modulation. But let's go back to using an envelope. There's 2 controls for this CV input. The first one is the attenuator that you can use to close down the signal you're sending into the CV input. So when I turn this down, the yellow envelope that I'm sending into the CV input is completely attenuated. And you can, of course, gradually open it up. Now, if I again invert the envelope I'm sending in manually, you can see that the yellow line goes down. We're also inverting the output. But when I just send in a positive envelope, you can still invert it by just using this switch here. Now the yellow line on data is still just the envelope that I'm sending in. So we're sending in a positive envelope, but you should be able to see that the output of boundary is inverted. And if I flick this switch into the positive position, the signal coming out of boundary is not inverted. Let me close this down. Then there's one other control here. Well, in fact, there's 2, but they both control the bias. The bias is just a signal that is summed to the CV inputs, and it kind of acts as the baseline from where the VCA starts working. So normally when you have this at 0 and you open the VCA, it starts opening from 0 and it closes down completely to 0, which of course gives you silence in between the notes. But you can turn up this baseline, so to speak. So there's always some sound going through, and then the effect of the CV we're sending in is just added to that or subtracted if I flip the polarity of the CV input. And I hope that you can see that these 2 controls kind of interact to shape the sound we're getting out of it, and it also controls if the sound is getting inverted or not. Because, for example, when we set the bias to, I'm just making a guess here, something like 2 volts, and then you send in a 5 volt envelope, but it's inverted, then the baseline will be 2 volts, at which point the saw wave is getting through a little bit and it's not inverted. And then when the envelope hits, which is now negative because we flicked this switch into the bottom position, it will subtract 5 volts from that 2 volt that we set with the bias switch. And of course this will cause the signal to invert whenever the CV that's controlling the VCA goes below 0. This is very confusing, and again I'm using too many words. Let's just stick to regular operation. So VCA is receiving a positive envelope and I'm not inverting this envelope. There's one more switch that I need to explain. When this switch is in the upper position, the bias knob has a range of 0 to 8 volts. And you can see that these two values are added together. So you can cause kind of soft clipping or rounding of your waves. So the range is 0 to 8 volts, with it completely closed when it's to the left, of course. And then when you flick this switch into the down position, the range of the bias knob is changed to being minus 8 volts to the left and plus 8 volts to the right, which also causes the saw wave that we are sending in to be inverted because we are opening the VCA with the bias, but it's negative voltage. When this switch is in the lower position, the knob is 0 when centered, and then when we turn it to the right, we just add up to 8 volts. You can use both of the CV inputs at the same time. Let me send in a cycling envelope here. This input has no attenuator, but apart from that, the functionality is exactly the same as the first CV input. Now I'm attenuating the signal that I'm sending into the second CV input manually. And then, of course, you can start inverting the effect of the signal we're sending into the first CV input. An interesting thing that you can use this inverting stuff for, if you want to, for example, create a ducking or sidechain compression, you can open the VCA manually by increasing the bias, and then you can trigger an envelope at the same time as your kick drum, and then when you invert it, you can see that whenever the envelope is coming in, the signal is being ducked. Now when you remove the signal from the CV input, it is just normal to whatever is coming out of the slew output. Let's just turn on the cycling for the function generator. At which point we can do all the things that I showed you, but just with the built-in function generator. You can send something into the slew input of the function generator and use that to open and close your VCA. You can use a rectified signal to open and close the VCA. There's really a lot that you can do with this. And this is going to be it for this video about Boundary by Schlappi Engineering. I think I confused you enough already. If there's any questions, please leave them in the comments. And if you liked this video, maybe you can share it with someone who is interested in the added functionality that Boundary has to offer. I mean, there's so much you can do with Boundary that's somewhat different to a regular envelope generator. If you really liked this video, you can support my work on Ko-fi or Patreon. The links for that are in the description. Thank you very much to the people who already did so. I really hope you learned something. Thanks for watching. Bye.